Most welcome.
Hello, hello. Thank you for your kind invitation to join this eminent group of high-powered brains.
Okay.
Okay.
So, if it's high-powered brain, should I leave?
No, I should leave, not you.
Okay, so I guess we are on Swiss time, so we probably should start. So, I'm Carlos Primo Braga, Associate Professor of Fundação Dom Cabral and a member of the group Punta del Este. And I'm gonna serve as a moderator for this webinar today, which is the first of the group Punta del Este with the candidates to the position of Director General of the WTO. The group Punta del Este is a network of academics, diplomats, former ministers in Latin America and Caribbean interested in the health and the role of the WTO and the health of the multilateral trade system. This is a difficult moment for the multilateral trade system, as we all know. And we are in this moment also of change of guard in terms of the Director General of the WTO. And that's why we are conducting these webinars with the candidates. And Hamid is the first one actually that we are having this opportunity to interact with. Full disclosure, I'm a great fan of Hamid. I have worked with him in the past when I was the senior trade advisor of the World Bank and responsible, among other areas, for trade and services. So I benefited from his expertise and wisdom during my period in Geneva as the trade advisor and later as the director for Europe of the World Bank. And also later at the Avian Group at IBD.
No, I'm getting it on my telephone.
So, Hamid, we have two questions just to begin the conversation.
I'm using my telephone for the connection.
And if Glenn Bonnekamp could put his mic off, we could start with these two questions, which are basically, what is your vision in terms of restoring the confidence and the functioning of the WTO? And on top of that, what would be your messages to Latin America, since most of the participants in this webinar come from this region? So, once again, thanks, Hamid, for taking the time, and it's a privilege to have the opportunity to hear your views on the future of the WTO.
Well, thank you so much, Carlos, for your kind invitation, and thank you, Alejandro, for also organizing this with the Punta del Este Group. It's great to be among old friends that I hold so much affection and respect for at this particular time in my endeavor through this campaign. To start with your questions, Carlos, I think let me say just something by way of an introduction about why I am running, because my profile is not a typical profile, obviously, because since the establishment of the WTO over the past 25 years, we've had ministers, and in one case, an ex-prime minister, and for 25 years, we've had this politician profile. The only exception is the incumbent. I firmly believe now that the WTO needs a different kind of leadership. And this is not a statement at all about past leaders. Actually, I have tremendous respect for all of them. They were all my colleagues. This is a statement rather about the kind of unprecedented crisis that the organization is going through, which is existential in nature. And we won't have many chances to try and correct the situation as it is. And in order to put this in perspective as well, I want to clarify a couple of points which I think are subject to public confusion. I'm sure within this group, confusion is not something I'm suggesting, but the public is so often confused about two things. First, what do we mean by reform? And the second, the nature of the job of the Director General. The reform we're talking about really here is very different from reforming a ministry or reforming another organization like the World Bank or the IMF or WHO. This is not about restructuring departments and reallocating resources. It's rather about reforming the treaty. That's the enforceable contract between sovereign governments. And we all know that the only way to introduce that kind of reform is through negotiations. And that brings me to the nature of the job of the Director General, which is that of the honest broker. And the honest broker stands on two legs, always. It's the authoritative knowledge of the system and how the system is put together and how it's supposed to function. And the second leg is the trust and confidence of the membership. What is my vision for the reform? And that brings me to your first question, Carlos. I think a proper vision for reform would have to start with a good diagnostic of why we are where we are today. Why is the WTO underperforming or malfunctioning, if I may say? And if we look at the past 20 years, I would see that the WTO has suffered from a chronic imbalance in its functions. And there are three vital functions: the dispute settlement, the negotiating function, and sort of regular functions which encompass transparency, the deliberative function, and everything that oversees the implementation of the treaties. What we've had, what I mean by the chronic imbalance, is that two of those three functions have actually subsided completely. They failed miserably. The negotiating function over the past 25 years, if we exclude financial services and telecoms, which were leftovers from the Uruguay round, the only two real outcomes of the negotiating function was the ITA 1 and 2 and the trade facilitation agreement. Now, that's not what was intended when the agreement entered into force in '95. The deliberative function has subsided completely because since we have been in a negotiating mode, so to speak, since the launch of the Doha round, all the deliberations of new issues and complex issues have sort of subsided. Now, the vision for reform, I think, would need to start with an acute awareness of the need to restore the balance across those three functions. In my speech to the General Council, I drew the analogy of the system standing on a tripod. And the original design of the system is that there has to be a balance in the weight distribution across the three legs of the tripod. We need to keep that in mind. Now, how do we do that? I suggest we start by repairing the negotiating function. And by negotiating function, by the way, I mean more generally the ability of people to come to the table and engage in constructive discussions, which is something we have lost. Even when we were talking about WTO reform, those conversations take place everywhere. In the G20, in other fora, at regional levels, but not in the WTO. So far, we have not had in the WTO a mainstream agenda for WTO reform discussions. But also, the dispute settlement function needs urgent attention. We have the MPIA, and I congratulate Alejandro for being one of the champions of that sort of sauvetage operation. But I would not want to see this as taking the pressure off reforming the dispute settlement function and reforming the appellate body. In other words, I don't want to prolong my answer any longer, but it has to be based on a political vision of how the system was supposed to function and how do we start repairing it. Now, of course, there is the deliberative function, which we've seen proposals, and we can think about how this needs to be also revitalized. But the first step would be to bring to the awareness of the political leaders in capitals that this system was designed to function in a balanced way. We cannot just focus on dispute settlement and say, okay, if we repair this, then the system would function. It will not, because that chronic imbalance is just not sustainable. With respect to Latin America, thinking about Latin American countries and developing countries more broadly, it sort of reminds me of when I came to Geneva, actually, in the beginning in '85, and I was 12 at the time, which you will all remember, of course. I came as Egypt's negotiator to the GATT. And it was a fascinating time to turn up in Geneva. That was right after Alejandro had left Geneva and abandoned the organization at the time when it was just about to start its biggest reform operation in the history of the system, operation called the Uruguay Round. Now, I lived through that and saw the kind of challenges that developing country negotiators would face in terms of information, in terms of expertise, in terms of actually understanding the issues. And if I compare that time with the time now that we're going through, trade policy issues have gained a lot of complexity over the years. So the first thing is how to help developing countries and within that Latin American countries as well in negotiating effectively. Because having this system with all what it offers for developing countries and how important it is in terms of supporting trade for development, we have to keep in mind that the interests of Latin American countries and other countries cannot actually be achieved except through the right kind of negotiated outcomes. Now, how do we arrive at those negotiated outcomes? It has to be based on informed decisions. Now, you can unpack this problem and come up with a number of things that can and should be done. But if I may take a step back and say, okay, what do we need when we start? I go back to the point about the political vision for how we start the reform, but also when we talk about negotiations, how do we package a negotiating agenda? Because this is where political vision is needed. What kind of negotiated agenda are we going to start with? We're approaching MC12, which is a turning point now, and we have to use this as a landmark. But what can we put together by way of a negotiating agenda and a process forward that can help Latin American countries? Because when we talk about capacity building and technical assistance and all that, that's one part of the story. But the rest of the story, I think, would lie with how do we put together a negotiating agenda that would respond to the strategic priorities of Latin American countries. Let me stop here. There's a lot more to say about this, but I would like to hear your questions and any comments you might have. So back to you, Carlos.
Thank you, Hamid. This was very helpful and clear, but let me start with a few questions here that touch on some of the points that you have already made, but we would appreciate if you could expand upon this. First, how you would characterize your personal qualities to be the next Director General of the WTO? Second, how do you see the role of the Director General and the Secretariat vis-a-vis the membership in general? And if you could also expand a little bit about what are the critical issues in terms of reform that you would like to advance if you were to be in a position to play this role of an honest broker among the membership of the WTO? So let's start with this. And let me just emphasize to all the participants that you can pose your questions through the chat facility. Myself and Alejandro and everybody has access to these questions. Okay, Hamid, back to you.
Thank you, Carlos. Let me slice this up and take your first question first. The qualities that what do I bring to the table? I bring to the table 35 years of experience, as you all know, but it's not just the experience about the knowledge in the system, but also about negotiating experience, the process of building convergence. And I bring also the reform experience. And when I came here, I started with the Uruguay round. That was the biggest reform project that one can think of, that transformed the little cottage called the GATT into this big mansion called the WTO. And as a developing country negotiator, we had to look at this project with a very open mind. This is actually one of the things that led me to use repeatedly a caption that I always use, which is, let's not focus on the future of the WTO now, but on the WTO of the future. Because the WTO of the future can look a bit different from this WTO. What have we learned from the past 25 years, and what have we learned from the reform experience of the Uruguay round? That's what I bring to the table. Now, of course, we cannot repeat history exactly the same way. Of course not. The situation is very different now. But we have to learn from our past. We have to learn not to repeat mistakes that we have made either during the Uruguay round or during the past 25 years of the life of the WTO. We have to be able to identify the elements of success, the enabling factors for success, and try to redeploy them and adapt them to new situations. We have to also to be, while we're doing that, we need to be acutely aware of the nature of reform, as I said, but in this kind of reform that involves negotiations, we have to be also aware of the risks that this might entail. In other words, we have to do it while making sure that we retain the fundamentals of the system intact. And as we all here know, the system is going through a very, very difficult time. It's going through a stress test that is unprecedented vis-a-vis its fundamentals, not least of which is the MFN principle itself. So in this kind of complex situation, what I bring to the table is that kind of experience, which is and knowledge, which is the first leg that the Director General or the honest broker should stand on. And I've been listening, this is among a group of friends, and I'll be frank, I've been listening to a lot of political leaders, including some of the esteemed and highly respected candidates, who conveniently dismiss substance as technical details. But actually, I don't think it works like that. We need to have the kind of political vision that is acutely aware of the political implications of the substantive details of the solutions that we will try to implement. You cannot really separate the substantive knowledge from the kind of political leadership, because without the substantive knowledge, you cannot really lead the kind of reform we're talking about. Keeping in mind also that the Director General is just an honest broker. He's not an executive. Now, what I also bring to the table is, I think, what I have enjoyed over the past 30 years in terms of the trust and confidence of the membership. For the past 30 years since I left the Egyptian government, I've been standing at equal distance from the entire membership, from the biggest to the smallest. And I have been the trusted friend to go to solve problems and consult on difficult and complex issues. I cherish this very much, and I would want to put this at the disposal of the membership to be able to contribute to a way out of this conundrum that the organization is facing. So that's what I bring to the table. Your second question about, I think it was about my role as Director General with the membership and the Secretariat as well. My role with the membership, I think I've responded to at least part of that. But also, the only thing I would add here is that my role would be also to give them insights, analysis, diagnostic views about the roots of problems, but also reveal to them what I think about the options, the tools that exist in the system, and how those tools may be employed to find ways forward. And you can take, to give you an example of that, you can take one problem and unpack it along the lines I'm suggesting. So if you take special and differential treatment, for example, as a problem, it's causing a lot of inflammation in the system, high emotions, highly politicized, a theological conversation. And what I would say for an issue like this is, can we please start with what we agree on and then see how we move forward? And what we agree on here is that A, nobody is suggesting that we do away with special and differential treatment. The conversation is only about how it applies, not about whether it should exist. The conversation is not about what exists already in the system, but it's about what comes forward in terms of future negotiated outcomes. So can we sit and talk about this really in a practical way? And here, I would say, in all honesty, let me bring to the table my own experience on that when we were drafting the services agreement, the GATS. And I see to my old friend Fernando de Mateo, who would relate exactly to the kind of the history that I'm talking about, because he was there. He's part of that dark history, by the way, and he is one of the architects for this agreement. And one of the issues that we had to deal with was special and differential treatment, and the kind of conversation that was taking place then is very similar to the conversation that is taking place now. But what we did was to unpack the problem and start with the purpose. We need to have a common sense of why do we have special and differential treatment? Is it about exonerating from obligations, or is it about enabling integration? And if it is about enabling integration, which we all agree on, then okay, how do we employ it in the best way that not only gives flexibility, but also gives priority to export interest of developing countries? And since developing countries are not homogeneous, how can we reach customized outcomes? What kind of negotiating modalities and legal forms of outcomes that would allow us to reach customized outcomes that would take into account the differences between different developing countries, so that you don't treat China the same way you treat Burkina Faso. These are realities, and I don't think that big developing countries would have any differences with that. They didn't have differences with that even in the early 90s, and reintroducing the kind of objective pragmatic thinking into a problem like this would require a lot of imparting experiences and knowledge. Now, vis-a-vis the Secretariat, I would think we need to go back to revitalizing the role of the Secretariat as a source of expertise and knowledge. We have an extraordinary world-class pool of expertise in the Secretariat. And we should not only put it at the disposal of members, but also should see how we continue to develop it in a way that would make the kind of knowledge that exists there commensurate with the new realities. And the new realities are quite complex. I hesitate to bring this issue sometimes depending on the settings, but I wouldn't hesitate in this setting that we need to have discussions about this complex area of interface between trade liberalization and facilitating cross-border and cross-jurisdictional businesses, while at the same time interfacing with all the areas of legitimate regulation which are inherently trade restrictive. And just as an example, digital trade is one area where a lot of these multidisciplinary discussions need to take place, and the Secretariat needs to continuously be better informed about how do you reconcile liberalization with privacy rules, with online consumer protection or cybersecurity or all that. That requires mobilizing the intellectual capacity of the Secretariat in a way that serves the membership with all neutrality and impartiality and everything, but develops also this kind of unique knowledge that feeds into the rulemaking process in these new areas. You had a third question, Carlos. Could you remind me what it was?
Well, basically, how you see, to a certain extent, you already mentioned this, the necessary reforms for the WTO at this point in time. And we have several questions coming that are exactly along these lines. For instance, Anita Bari is asking to what extent the tradition of consensus is the real elephant in the room. So how do you see this question? Should we be going for plurilaterals in a more dynamic manner? So
that's an excellent question, and my view on that, which is based on what we have now. This is not a matter of interpretation or anything, but what we have now. The rule of consensus is the golden rule in the WTO. But what I would say is that we should not impose a consensus requirement where it is not required. And particularly when it comes to negotiations. This question of plurilaterals also has been subject to a lot of confusion among the broader public. And I would start by clarifying really the nature of the problem. And when it comes to plurilaterals, the first thing I would say is that we need to distinguish between outcomes and processes. Because if we're talking about plurilateral processes that produce multilateral outcomes, which is like the joint statement initiatives and negotiations that we have now, I would ask the question, what is new about this? This has been the predominant form of negotiations that we've had in the system for the past 70 years, even starting with tariff rounds, which is a negotiation among a subset of the membership that produces an outcome that is applied on MFN basis. Now, of course, there are negotiating questions here to think about and work out in the negotiations relating to whether you have critical mass in the outcome, whether you reduce the free rider risk. All these are questions, but these are questions that would be sorted out in the negotiations themselves. But from a rules perspective, to say, oh, you need a consensus decision in order to launch a plurilateral negotiation, an open plurilateral negotiation in the WTO, like the ITA or financial services or telecommunications, I would ask honestly the question, where do you see that written in the rule book? To the contrary, you would find agreements like the GATS, which actually calls for plurilateral negotiations. So why all of a sudden this has become anti-multilateralism? It isn't. This is an example of one of the things that I think the Director General, as the honest broker with authoritative knowledge, would come and say, please, tell me. And sometimes actually, Carlos, getting some headway on one issue or the other is not just by providing insightful answers or statements, but sometimes it's by asking the right question. And the right question I would ask here is, show me where in the rules does it say that in order to launch a plurilateral negotiation on e-commerce, for example, aiming at multilaterally applicable MFN-based outcome, where does it say you need a consensus to decide on this? Keeping in mind that within that same legal system we're operating in, non-participants would have the procedures that would legally guarantee that nothing in such outcomes would undermine their pre-existing rights. So where does the problem lie? And do you need to separate the politically motivated views from the real substance of what we're dealing with? So the short answer to your question is consensus, of course, it's the rule. And we should follow consensus, but don't impose it where it's not required, because you end up actually, clogging up the whole system. Back to you.
Okay, well, Hector Torres has placed a similar question, but he is basically addressing the current situation, pointing out that if it is difficult to get consensus, even to appoint an interim DG for the WTO for the time being, how optimistic are you that you can identify enablers of success to promote consensus if you were to be the Director General?
I think what I said does not mean that consensus decisions will be easy. No. My answer was about not imposing a consensus requirement where it's not legally required. But of course, there will be other decisions which would have to be taken by consensus. And actually, there are certain things, particularly when it comes to all the rules that relate to institutional provisions and institutional frameworks like the DSU. If anything is going to be done, it has to be done by consensus. Now, what can we do to make consensus decisions a bit easier? I would start by actually recalling and reinstituting the common purpose behind the system. Really, one of the things that we have seen over the past 20 years is the fading sense of common purpose behind the system. Why are we there? We need to have an honest conversation about this. Do you want to trade with each other? Are we there because A, trade is important for growth and development and for prosperity of societies and welfare and peace and security? All the purpose as it is expressed in the preamble of the Marrakesh Agreement. Do we believe in that? And do we believe that in order for trade to flourish, you need rules, and therefore the WTO is the guarantor for stability and predictability? We are in the same boat, as I've been saying, but we're not rowing in the same direction. So can we recall that common purpose and start from there and say, all right, if we believe in that common purpose, this is going to be our guiding star. It would be easier to move forward. I believe so. Like in this situation, we couldn't, there is no agreement on the interim. Okay, what is the purpose in this situation? The purpose is just to bridge a time gap. But the spirit of that common purpose is not there. It has faded away. And that needs to be brought back. Because if we don't have common purpose, then it's very difficult to get anything done. And starting with that, with political leaders, this is what political leaders need to reaffirm and mobilize their political will behind. That common purpose behind the system. That's why it was created, that's why we're here. And those who don't believe in that common purpose should actually be a bit more upfront about what they want. Because it's no use leaving the root cause of the problem. It will continue to produce painful situations But that would be my start. So you can say that to deal with consensus, there's two ways. A, don't require it while it's not needed, and B, try to have members moving in the same direction by restoring the sense of common purpose. Restoring that sense, I think, is critical in the way ahead. Carlos?
Okay, we are getting close to the end of our time. I have a question from Simon Evanet, which is very topical. And he's basically asking, had you been Director General when the coronavirus hit, what would you have done differently in leading the Secretariat? Could the WTO machinery have been used to greater effect?
That's a very difficult question to answer. What I would have done, and maybe some of that has been done already, because I've been keeping my social distance from the WTO in keeping with the spirit of the corona pandemic. But I would first of all recall or restore the willingness of members to act in a collaborative way, in a more collaborative way. I have been doing this in other fora other than the WTO in terms of the role of the WTO during the coronavirus. I would think or distinguish between short term and long term. In the short term, I would mobilize a research team, but also a representative research team from different divisions, because so often, particularly over the past few years, political leaders tend to forget that when we talk about trade, we're not just talking about merchandise trade. We're also talking about services trade, and having a pandemic-focused team in the Secretariat, producing analysis, not just research, but trying to get the sort of precious information that comes out of Simon's operation, and see what kind of analysis can we have from this, and how do we make sure that we hold members accountable to what in terms of what they're doing vis-a-vis the WTO. In other words, we keep saying, all measures in the short term should be in conformity with WTO rules. Exceptional measures should be within the limits of what is necessary. It has to be time-bound. It has to be notified to the WTO. Well, can we actually have more accurate monitoring of who's notifying and who's not? I would hold members more accountable than they are. And there are tools through which this can be done. But this is in the short term, as we say, in order to ensure that value chains and supply chains operate smoothly. But in terms of the long term, I would take all the lessons that we have learned from the pandemic and try to make that as part of the perspective of WTO reform going forward. Because once we come out on the other side of this crisis, a strong WTO is going to be indispensable for economic recovery, because trade would have a huge role to play. And that perspective should be part of the political vision that political leaders and trade ministers, but also political leaders more generally, have to keep in mind when we approach WTO reform. Because we've learned a lot of things from the pandemic now. We can talk for an entire afternoon about digital trade and how it's flourishing as a result of the pandemic, and other forms of trade and how they got hurt, and different sectors, some are winners, some are losers. What do we expect in the long run, and what kind of vision would the WTO have for future trade, be it trade in goods or trade in services? There's so much to be learned from this situation and project in the future. And this is why I keep thinking about the WTO of the future, which could very well look a bit different from this WTO. So back to you, Carlos.
Very good, Hamid. Well, we are getting to the end, but there are two questions here. One of them is the elephant in the room, which is what role should the WTO play in terms of the bilateral conflict between the US and China at this point in time? And other than that, we also have a question in terms of as the next Director General, what would you do in your first 100 days at the helm of the WTO? This is a question from Anabel Gonzalez.
Thank you. Concerning the bilateral, I think the bilateral tension between US and China is not just bilateral. That's the reality. Again, I try to start my thinking with a diagnostic view of why we are where we are today. And one of the diagnostic elements that I truly believe in is that the tension between US and China in good part is the result of the malfunction of the WTO. Because part of the functions of the WTO, particularly if you see it, if you look at it as the tripod that I was talking about, had the two other functions, which is a negotiating function and a deliberative function, performed at the level to which they were intended, good part of the problems between US and China could have been averted. Whether it's about the lack of transparency, notifications, deliberating the problems that have arisen, but also using the existing tools in the system, such as cross notifications. We don't get cross notifications. Why? Because the environment is not conducive, because the common purpose has faded away, because there is no political will to use the system the way it was designed to be used. In other words, over the past 20 years, the malfunction on the negotiating side and the regular functions and the deliberative side have resulted in a lot of problems festering and growing into this kind of horrible tension that we see now. Now, of course, there are other political aspects. So what I would do, first of all, is I would try to through the right kind of analysis, to persuade the two sides that the WTO should be part of the solution, not part of the problem as seen by some. Second, there are ways forward, but we need to the extent possible, try to make a distinction. And here I don't want to be too optimistic or too idealistic, but I think we need to try to the extent possible to separate the trade tensions from the broader geopolitical difficulties, which the WTO cannot resolve at all. But try to look at the trade agenda as an area where some win-win outcomes can be achieved. And it is not impossible. You just need to mobilize the right kind of political vision and the right kind of policy attitudes on both sides. But in doing so, we also need to convince both sides that this tension is not just bilateral. It has implications for other members, and whatever they arrive at by way of solutions would have implications for other members as well. And there I would stress the point about the distinction between bilateral resolution of problems and multilateral resolution. Because in my view, bilateral resolutions are by definition more transactional and less sustainable. Multilateral solutions for tensions are by definition more principle-based and more sustainable. And I would try to make that the narrative that would bring them to the table together with other members of the WTO as well, so that it becomes a process of moving forward towards the WTO of the future. And there are obvious agenda items which are of a multilateral nature that in order to resolve these bilateral tensions, they would have to get into. If we're going to start negotiating new rules on subsidies, then fine. Let's put that on the table. And when we talk about subsidies, we're not just talking about industrial subsidies, we're also talking about agricultural subsidies, and we're also talking about other areas. That brings us back, Carlos, to what I was saying in the beginning about the political vision of packaging an agenda. Because, you know, some people would ask the question, how would you bring China to the table to renegotiate rules on industrial subsidies? I say, this can only happen in a negotiation where the agenda is constructed in a way that provides incentives to bring everyone around the table. That's how you start a negotiation. But you're not going to start a negotiation by a single item that serves one constituency, and there are others on the other side who are expected to pay without getting anything in return. We're talking about trade-offs. How do you construct a balanced agenda with trade-offs? Now, the first 100 days, I would hit the ground running in the direction of MC12. MC12 must be a point where we move the WTO into positive territory. And by that, I mean two things. First, we need to come to a reliable, ambitious, but realistic agenda about WTO reform discussions. I don't mean just a list of items, I mean an insightful agenda with a process, so that post MC12 would be a well-charted route towards reforming the WTO. The second is to mark concrete progress on ongoing negotiations, starting with fisheries subsidies, of course, which had an internationally agreed deadline. I'm not sure we're going to meet the end of 2020 by way of deadline, but certainly by all means, we have to conclude it by MC12. There are so many problems still to unpack, although by now there's a common negotiated text, but it's a long way from resolution. So fishery subsidies would need to be concluded, but also some concrete progress on the joint statement initiatives that are on the table now. I don't see any of them being concluded by MC12, but I see that there is a very good chance of registering concrete progress with a roadmap on what should happen and the timeline beyond MC12. And the third point in reviving the negotiating agenda, I would go back to the Doha issues, not the Doha framework, but there are Doha issues which will not go away. And I would go back to what we started with, services and agriculture. These are not going to go away. These are pending negotiating files. And with that, we need to pick the pieces of what could make a credible negotiating agenda moving forward that will provide incentives for all constituencies to come around the table. Now, is that ambitious? Absolutely. Is it possible? I believe so. Between whenever we hit the ground running and MC12. It might be a little more than 100 days, but just a little bit of slack actually might be helpful. So back to you, Carlos.
Okay, Hamid, this was excellent. As you already said, it's a very ambitious agenda for the first 100 days. We can only wish you good luck in this process. And one thing that you mentioned with great clarity is the difference between bilateral processes and multilateral negotiations and the importance that the WTO can have in this situation. Having said that, we have to ask ourselves, is it possible in the world where we live today to separate geopolitical from economic considerations, and this probably is one of the main challenges for the multilateral trade system. When we were in the 1990s, the dream of an hegemon could separate the geopolitical and economic issues. Nowadays, I would argue this is much more difficult. But we are sure that you have good answers to all these questions. And once again, we'd like to thank you for the opportunity to discussing your ideas and wish you good luck in the process. Let me end by saying that tomorrow we're gonna have another webinar, this time with Jesus Sead, and we'll start at 10:30 Montevideo time, but this, just to make Fernando happy, is going to be very early, 8:30 in Mexico, and 3:30 p.m. Central European time. So, to all of you who had a chance to join us, and particularly to Hamid, thanks in the name of the Grupo Punta del Este for the opportunity to hear your ideas, and again, good luck in this process.
Thank you so much, Carlos, and thank you, Alejandro, and everyone. And great to see you, Fernando. I don't see the rest on the screen, but it's been a tremendous pleasure for me to be with all of you. Thank you so much. And
everybody was very attentive to your presentation, and I can assure you that even Clan Bunnekamp didn't sleep during our intervention.
Are you sure?
Yeah, I can see him.
Well, thank you so much. Take care.
Bye. Good luck.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Hamid.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.